Hello, I want to welcome you to the Meacham interviews. I'm Rick Jackson, and today we have Seth Michelson. Seth, procedure has often been to start off with a poem. So, would you like to read us a poem?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and thank you for having me, Rick. It's a joy to be here. I brought a poem here. It's called Emergency Medicine, and it's a love poem, or my version of a love poem.
Your wife's in medicine.
My wife's in medicine, yeah. And this is when she was working at LA County Hospital, a big county hospital in Los Angeles, California. It's called Emergency Medicine. And this is from my book, Eyes Like Broken Windows. I don't have a copy because I just gave one away to somebody at at the hotel who I saw at the bar while I was waiting to be picked up. So, emergency medicine. My wife's hands, small white birds, flutter over the new arrival. A child fallen from a rooftop, blood-filled lungs, a shattered face. In my wife's hands, gloveless, dry from constant washing, give off the scent of lemon soap as they enter each wound. By the glare of a sterile lamp, her fingertips shine, healing with conjured light, as if nothing were unfixable. Like this she touches and touches, those small birds gaining speed, as they dart, dive and twist through a pageantry of swift maneuvers, building an airway from a rubber tube, threading blue sutures into skin, draining the lungs of thick, dark blood, so the heart again can feed.
Well, thank you. It starts off in this really dark place and ends off as a kind of redemptive, transcending poem. How did that come about, that poem?
So she works very hard at a stressful job, like so many people in healthcare, in overwhelming conditions that I can't imagine enduring myself. And so much of what she endures physically is also rigorous psychologically. And so there are amazing stories of the intensity of the experiences that colleagues and she have each shift. And so it was born out of admiration for her and her determination and her compassion, her patience, her learning that's committed to such immediate social good. And it's a love poem not only for her, but for all people working in healthcare in that way, in the way that they're salvific work and real important work. And poetically, sort of reflecting on the belly feel of that, of carrying those stories. And I like an idea from Taha Muhammad Ali, who's a great Palestinian poet. He's got a poem called Twigs, and he says in there that art is worthless unless it plants a measure of splendor in people's hearts. And so it's an important notion to me.
I love that, yeah. It's interesting, too, that what you're doing is, in a sense, I guess all poems do this, but you're taking an experience from someone who you're close and intimate with and talking about your experience of her experience and then, in a sense, translating it into words for the audience to feel that gut feeling that you were talking about. And let's talk a little bit about how that works and the limitations, because we can never get exactly in words what the original experience is, but we try to, the words are kind of metaphor in a way, maybe. I don't know, but what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. And it's delicate work. It's problematic work in many ways. And I try to be really conscientious as I do it, at least in revision. And self-censoring later, this shouldn't go out, because it is a certain presumption, right, in speaking someone else's experience that you have to treat with caution, be thoughtful about, I guess. I try never to be self-censorious in the writing process, but not every poem needs to be shared, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people that will say, I say this because recently I've been at a couple of readings where somebody will write something about a political situation, say, or a situation with gender issues or something like that, and there'll be some complaints from some people that they're appropriating so-and-so's subject. How do you feel about that?
That we're all hybrid, we're all plurivocal, and we have personal interests, but also civic responsibility, I think, in certain ways, to contribute to these discussions. And so no one has exclusive domain over crucial issues to global democracy, like racism, gender discrimination. And at the same time, I try to be careful in how I participate in those discussions poetically. For example, in Eyes Like Broken Windows, it's a 3-part book, and in the central part there's a heroic crown of sonnets. And for those watching us today who might not know the form, a sonnet is a 14-line poem, as you know very well, and the heroic crown is where the last line of the first poem cascades into the second, becoming the first line of the second poem. And there's a crown of sonnets, which are 7 sonnets that are laced together like a crown that way. A heroic crown has 14 sonnets that are laced together until the 14th sonnet's final line, its 14th line, is the first line of the first poem. And then also I have a 15th sonnet that's the first lines of all the poems put together in its own poem. And that is a complex form that's testing sort of the rigidities, the strictures of boundaries, because I'm talking about 3 overlapping stories of my wife's immigration to the United States from Argentina, of my experience. One of my moments in living in Argentina, I lived with a war criminal unknowingly. And then I also talk about a young woman that he murdered, who was a 19-year-old woman. Her name was Sonia Beatriz Gonzalez, and the crown is called The Crown for Sonia. And so it talks about these 3 overlapping stories. My wife's flight from the country during this time, war criminal operating during that time, and one of the women that he murdered. And it's bilingual in Spanish and English. And how to write about genocide, for example, right? And I'm telling someone else's, I'm telling 3 other people's stories in terms of the interwoven narratives of that. And my interest is also formal, poetic interest in how to build that and to test the limits of form and to rupture form where necessary. And it's a complicated subject. I'm always cautious. Can you write beautifully about that sort of extreme violence? You've written some beautiful poems, I know, about Serbian violence that I admire very much. And you out there in YouTube landia should check them out. But I think too of Aristotle and sort of early poetry criticism, saying you can write beautifully about horrific things, and it's okay.
Yeah, I think it's the way that you can put things together. It's interesting you're talking about the heroic crown of sonnets, and a friend of mine, Slovenia, actually writes that one a lot like that. But I wonder, did that form help generate the ideas in the poem, or did the ideas sort of fall into them? It's a kind of chicken and egg question in a way, but what effect do you think writing in that form had on the final version of the poem, on sequence?
I think it's propulsive, of the triple narrative. It's the form creates crucial tension, irresolvable tensions, right? That ultimately are sort of metaphorical reflections on the impossibility of thinking about these problems and this catastrophic violence and mortality and personal responsibility, the limits of understanding, the impossibility of always trying to speak, which goes to all poems too, right, of trying to say what's unspeakable, really what most great poems are trying to do. And for me, as counterintuitive as it may seem, that really tight form is loosing, freeing in terms of recognizing sort of the inexorable schisms in our ability to render in language this experience, right? So it's always approximate, it's always reductive, it's always diminished, and it's incoherent in a certain way, right? The form, and also it's why it's bilingual, right? Because it's not only transcultural narratively, but the language is always groping impossibly to articulate what escapes it. And so there's a frustration in moving against the form, within the form, against the language, within the language, across languages. That's really important to me poetically as I think about participating in this rememoration of this genocide.
You find that, I know you do a lot of translating too, and it's a similar kind of issue. Because in a way you're kind of appropriating somebody else's voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's a great pleasure, a private sort of pleasure that I really enjoy, is struggling through another writer's voice in that way. It's very intimate. I try to translate feminist poetry from South America. So I've got a book by a very established, wonderful poet named Tamara Kamensain called The Ghetto. And it's a very intimate eulogic book by her for her father's death. And it's beautiful and difficult poetry. And then a young Uruguayan poet named Victoria Stoll about gendered violence called Bicho Bola, which is a roly-poly bug or a pill bug. And it's extremely difficult because now it's not only different culture, different time, but adding gender, right? And translating these women's experiences is very hard. And it's a great pleasure and a privilege to work in their voices and to work with them. And then I worked with an Indian poet named Radhi Saxena, and bringing in a book called Dreaming in Another Land, which is sort of a selected of her work from the Hindi and some Sanskrit to English. And now I'm working with Amir Orr, an Israeli poet, to bring into English a new collection of his. And you're also stylizing and editing and redacting, and because I'm bringing into sort of a contemporary U.S. idiomatic English. And it's a tremendous privilege and responsibility, but also a very sort of pleasure to play and work and take very seriously, but also delight in the possibility and working impossibly, knowing it impossible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But also gifting, hopefully, some good poems to a monolingual English audience that wouldn't otherwise have access to them. And I think that's better than the silence of not having.
Absolutely. I think translation is really absolutely crucial. I want to thank you for being here today, and sorry our time is up.